Shit, he muttered. He looked over his shoulder. Anthony and Jesse Numeroff were in the back of the boat, holding onto the railing, glaring at him. "Sorry about that," Brent said. He reversed the engine and the boat eased back, tree limbs snapping as they released their hold on the bow. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Anthony and Jesse exchanging worried looks. Jesse said something under his breath to Anthony and nodded toward Brent. This wasn't good, and Brent knew it. The Wonder Twins had been riding his ass since they set out, and it was starting to really piss him off. Anthony whispered something else to Jesse, then started walking forward. "Shit," Brent muttered again. Anthony put a hand on the windscreen above the steering wheel, the other on the seat back behind Brent's head. He was smaller than Brent, but that had never made any difference. Anthony was the one blessed with the looks and the speed and the self-confidence that opened every door. Brent got none of that. And when his younger brother loomed over him, as he was doing now, Brent, though physically huge compared to Anthony, felt small. "What the fuck are you doing, Brent? We're trying to load dynamite back there, for Christ's sake." "I'm sorry," Brent said without looking at him. "You're sorry?" There was a pause, and when Anthony spoke again, his voice was a savage whisper. "Holy shit, you've been drinking! You motherfucker, you've been drinking, haven't you?" Anthony glanced back at Jesse in the rear of the boat, then turned back to Brent. "What the fuck's wrong with you? You know how important this is." "I'm sorry," Brent muttered. "Don't tell me you're fucking sorry," Anthony said. "I don't give a rat's ass about sorry. I need you sharp. I need to know I can count on you." Brent said nothing. "Did you bring a bottle?" Anthony asked. A pause. "Answer me! Did you bring a bottle with you on this boat?" "No," Brent said. It wasn't as much a lie as an equivocation. He had poured most of a pint of vodka into a thermos of grape juice that he'd been slowly nursing since before they'd left the EOC. The thermos was tucked out of sight, down by his feet, hidden by a life-preserver. "You better not have," Anthony said. "This is too important for you to fuck it all up." "I'm not going to fuck it up," Brent said. Jesse looked at them, frowning. "Keep your voice down," Anthony said. His voice was an angry whisper. "I'm not going to fuck this up," Brent said, also whispering. Though Anthony had always been the gifted one, the cool one, the one their dad thought of as a chip off the old block, it nonetheless rankled Brent to be accused of fucking up. He was doing his part, wasn't he? Maybe he wasn't going down into the vault with them. Maybe they wouldn't trust him to be within arm's length of the dynamite they carried. But damn it, he was doing his part. Sure, he'd had a couple pulls off the thermos, but he wasn't drunk. He had got them here, and he would get them back out again. "I'm gonna do my part," he said. Anthony eyed him coolly. "Yeah," he said, "you do that. Come on back here with me, and don't you dare stumble. Don't you dare slur your words. You keep your shit together until we're all done. Got it?" Brent wanted to raise his chin and look his younger brother in the eye, but he couldn't. "I got it," he muttered. "All right, let's go." They walked back to where Jesse was packing the last of their gear. Jesse looked up at the two brothers and said, "Problems?" "No problems," Anthony said, a little too harshly. Jesse's doubtful gaze lingered on Brent for just a moment. Then he handed one of the bags to Anthony. "That's the last of it." Brent watched the two men readying their gear. They worked together seamlessly. Always had. Back in high school, while Brent was silently waiting out his senior year in a desperate attempt not to get noticed, Anthony and Jesse were building reputations as the best shortstop and second baseman combination in Texas high school baseball. They were only sophomores at the time, but they were already local celebrities. One of the nightly news sportscasters had even called them the Wonder Twins. At the time, Brent had been perfectly willing to step back and let his younger brother grab the limelight. At least no one was bothering him while they were worshipping his little brother. He had to swallow some pride, sure, but he knew his own limitations. He knew he wasn't in their league. He drank too much, for one thing. Even back in high school, he drank too much. And with the drinking came melancholic fits of depression and self-abuse, which made him a chore to be around. Underneath it all was an unpleasantness, a surliness that came from the realization that he was tolerated merely because of his proximity to Anthony and Jessie, the Wonder Twins, but only tolerated, never welcomed. He knew that about himself even then. Brent had hid the resentment back then, and he hid it now. He had grown used to it. He was good at it. Jessie was explaining their schedule, but Brent found it hard to stay focused. He let his attention wander across his surroundings, across the murky water that covered the streets, the cars, nearly everything. They had stopped at the corner of Canal and Styles, just north of Eastwood Park. It was past dusk, and their surroundings were lost in deepening shadows. As he watched, the night, like the floodwaters, seemed to rise all around him, filling the areas below trees and in the alleys between buildings first, before spreading into the street and off to the horizon. Looking down Canal Street toward Lockwood, Brent could just see a long line of brick buildings, all of them with the windows busted out. Here and there the cabs of a few of the larger trucks were still visible. Black wooden telephone poles jutted out of the water at odd angles, like the skeletal ruins of old docks. Everywhere he looked, the city was still, the air charged with that restless, electric murmur that precedes a storm. And somewhere out there, someone was moaning. Brent frowned. He looked back at Anthony and Brett. The Wonder Twins had their heads bent over a laminated map spread out on the white top of a red igloo cooler. Apparently, neither of them had heard the sound. He turned back to the flooded ruins and listened. Nothing. He strained his senses against the gathering darkness, trying to pick up the sound again. And there it was. Yes, it was someone moaning. There for a moment he hadn't been sure, thought for a dreadful second that maybe he really had had too much to drink. But he was sure of what he'd heard now. The sound was coming from one of the buildings up on the left side of Canal Street. Past the Church's Chicken? He couldn't tell. Maybe the parking garage? Or that old white house over there? The noise was distant, muffled, but it was definitely there. Someone was moaning for help. "Brent?" Jessie said. "Hey, Brent, you with us?" "Huh?" "Oh, Jesus," Jessie said. He slapped the map and looked at Anthony. "Seriously? You said he was sober." "He is," Anthony said. "Aren't you, Brent?" Brent looked at them, his thumb hooked back over his shoulder in the direction of the noise. "You guys didn't hear that?" "Hear what?" Jessie snapped. He listened. The night was pulsing with the drone of mosquitoes and frogs. Jessie shrugged. "What, Brent? I don't hear shit." "I thought I heard somebody moaning." Anthony snapped his fingers at Brent's face. "Hey," he said, "there's nobody out there. Pay attention to this right here." He tapped the map. "We don't have much time, and I need to make sure you know this. We won't get a second chance." Brent hesitated a moment, his attention lingering on the ruins. "Yeah," he said at last. He blinked at the map, trying to focus. "Yeah, I'm looking." Brent watched the Wonder Twins slip into the water and go gliding over the sidewalk along Canal Street, dark shapes in the dark water. From the map, and what little of the briefing he'd been able to follow, Brent knew they were going to swim up to the next intersection, where Canal met Lockwood, and enter the Texas Chemical Bank from the far side of the building, just around the corner, so that should someone official come along and question what Brent was doing there in the boat, he would have some measure of plausible deniability. He didn't understand the rest of their plan, and, truth be told, hadn't tried to. It seemed to involve an awful lot of math for just blowing something up. And besides, from here on out, there were only two parts of the operation that mattered for him. The first was that he had about 45 minutes to wait while the Wonder Twins blew the vault and surfaced with the cash. The second was to keep a weather eye on his surroundings. If he saw anybody that might give them trouble, he was to hit a button on a small black box Jesse had given him. The button would trigger a signal on a device Jesse wore about his wrist, warning them it wasn't safe topside. That much he could do, and so Brent sat down behind the wheel and waited, listening to the wind in the trees and the gentle lapping of the water against the boat's hull. The thermos with the grape juice and vodka was still down at his feet, and he took it out. He had about half the mixture in there, and that was just about right. He envisioned himself tilting it back, feeling the alcohol burn in his nostrils right before it hit his tongue and sizzle down his throat. There wasn't enough in there to get him wasted. He couldn't afford that. But it would tide him over until this operation, as the Wonder Twins called it, was done, and he could go somewhere quiet and start drinking seriously. And then he would drink and drink until everything went. An unexpected sob in his throat made him pause. He put the thermos down, and for a moment thought he might start crying. Sniffling, he rubbed at his eyes with the back of his hand. Fucking pathetic, he thought. Weak and pathetic. Here he was, a grown man, about to break down like a scolded child. He sat there for a long time, waiting on the tears, just on the verge of losing control. But to his surprise, they didn't come. Brent was mad at himself for the weakness, but wasn't surprised by it. Like several other heavy drinkers he knew, Brent had spent a lot of time studying his addiction. Over the last few years, his life had taken up a sort of orbit around drinking. He couldn't deny that. He thought about it all the time. So yes, liquor was an addiction that owned him, no matter how much he would have liked to believe otherwise. He knew this about himself. No sense in lying about it. Call a spade, after all, as Daddy always said. He went through periods where he needed liquor, where he hated it, where he couldn't remember what he'd done while drinking it. Other times he'd stormed through his apartment, pouring out every single bottle he'd hidden around the place. But love it, need it, or hate it, he always came back to it. Liquor had its own gravitational hold on him. Or, if he was in one of his more self-destructive moods, it was the hole at the bottom of the commode, and he was the turd circling it. But regardless of his moods, regardless of the metaphor he used to describe his circumstances, its hold on him was real, and it was relentless. He scooped up the thermos and took a long drink. It was warm and syrupy, harsh as homemade moonshine. And God, did it ever feel good. He'd been drunk pretty much continuously since Gabriella, and all the days and all the things he'd done since then seemed a blur. But not all his memories were gone. The really shameful ones, those he remembered with perfect clarity. Memories like being in police headquarters, appearing before the chief's Vehicle Accident Advisory Board. God, what a disaster that had been. He sat the thermos down on his knee and let the memory play out in his mind. He was powerless to stop it anyway. The board was a panel of 7 officers, all of them clean-cut and serious, sober-looking, charged with hearing the facts of his latest crash and then making a decision on his punishment that they would then forward to the chief of police. The board's commander was Captain Ricky Macklin, one of his dad's partners from back in their days in homicide. Brent had been trying his hardest to crawl into a shell. His shoulders were stooped, his uniform a wrinkled mess, his mind a wrinkled mess, too. He felt as if his mouth was full of sand. "Brent," Macklin said, "We're waiting." Brent had looked up at Macklin, at the other members of the board, all of them watching him expectantly, and said, I, and realized with a panic akin to drowning that there was nothing more. He had nothing. His mind was a blank slate. He looked at the young patrolman to his right, the man's uniform pressed and clean, his face freshly shaven, and sweat popped out all over Brent's body. His face felt hot, his skin damp. What was he doing here? What did they want from him? Couldn't they just leave him the fuck alone? "Brent," Macklin said, "the 300 block of Irving? You sideswiped a parked car." The utter bewilderment must have been obvious on his face. He couldn't remember any of it. He had no recollection of any accident. In his mind, there was only a long stretch of black, like an endless road with no scenery, where the memory should have been. He hung his head, defeated. Macklin had said something then that Brent didn't catch, but he must have dismissed the other members of the board, for they rose as a body and slowly exited the conference room. When Brent looked up, he and Macklin were the only two left in the room, sitting at opposite ends of a long oval table. "Brent," Macklin said, "your dad is one of my oldest friends. I remember driving him to the hospital the night your younger brother was born. I care about your family, son. So tell me, what the fuck is going on with you? How did you get like this?" Brent had no answer. He'd sat there beneath an air-conditioning vent, sweating, ineffably miserable, embarrassed beyond— He heard the moaning again. Brent's pulse quickened. He stood up, scanned the dark and flooded buildings, and saw nothing. He heard nothing. Trees rustled in the wind, and the moon's reflection winked off the rippling floodwaters. But there was no movement, and no other sounds. Not even the frogs, he realized. The night had pulsed with their noises earlier. Where were the frogs? The question hung in his mind and wouldn't let go. It unsettled him somehow. Had they left because of the approaching storm? Had they used that magical sixth sense that animals had that warned them of approaching natural disasters? Mardell was just hours away, after all. That must be it, he thought. He lifted the thermos to his lips and was surprised to find it empty. He shook it. There was a little down there in the bottom, but just the dregs. Had he really drank it all? Strange. He didn't remember doing that. The sound came again. Behind him this time. Brent spun around. There was a car wash on the far side of Canal Street, one of those drive-into-the-stall-and-do-it-yourself places, and beyond that a corner market and a Church's Chicken. On the opposite side of the street was a square-looking brown brick building, the windows dark and vacant and eye-like. A few trees, a few cars, poked up above the surface of the water in front of the building. There was a figure moving around out there, crossing behind the brown brick building. Brent could only see the figure's head and shoulders, wasn't even sure if it was a man or a woman. But there was definitely a person out there. "Hello?" Brent called out. An answering shriek came from somewhere to his right. He spun around, his heart beating frantically in his chest. That familiar chewed aspirin taste on the back of his tongue was back. He tried to swallow it down and couldn't. He spun around again, scanning for movement, and saw none. In that instant he realized how very alone he was, how very frightened. Really and truly frightened. He stood there in the boat, watching the ruined buildings and the floodwaters, and it seemed to him that the buildings were actually leaning toward him, as though they expected something. For a moment he considered hitting the alert button Jessie had given him. But the thought of what Jesse and Anthony might say if they scrambled back to the boat and found that there was nothing wrong but a paranoid drunk screwing up their operation made him put the alert button down on the seat. But was he just a paranoid drunk? In his heart he didn't believe so. This wasn't, after all, the kind of fear that had followed him during his early days on patrol. That fear made sense. Fear that some abusive and jealous husband might charge out of a back room during a family disturbance with a shotgun and blast his brains all over the front door. Fear that he might actually find that cottonmouth that had got into some lady's kitchen. Fear that he might lose his job if he couldn't control his drinking. Those were all real, solid fears. But this wasn't that kind of fear. It had a dreamlike quality to it, one that he hadn't felt since he was a child. Stepping down a long staircase into a darkened basement, dead certain that some hideous thing with chitinous claws for hands and merciless yellow eyes and breath that smelled of the morgue was waiting for him down there in the dark. It was that kind of fear. He tried shaking his head to loosen the fear's hold on his mind. It made no sense, after all. Why should he feel that every vacant window was an eye leering down on him? Why should the very wind itself smell of death and corruption? There were no ghosts out here. Certainly none but those made of alcohol. Brett's hands were trembling badly, and it took him several tries to turn over the stopwatch Jesse had left for him. 8 minutes left, provided everything was going according to schedule. Jesus, he thought. Hurry up, you guys. A splash behind him. He spun around. Looking out across the flooded street, he thought he saw people in the water. He blinked, leaned forward, squinting into the dark. Yes, there were people out there, wading down the flooded street. 4, 6, no, 10 of them. At the same moment, a Coast Guard helicopter, one of the big HH-60 Jayhawks, seemed to drop down out of the air above him, lighting him up with high-intensity spotlights. He threw up an arm to shield his eyes. Where it had come from? He hadn't heard anything. 1 minute the sky above him had been clear, the wind whistling monotonously. The next, he could feel the thropping of the rotors reverberating off his chest. The noise was deafening. The downwash of air from the helicopter's rotors picked up trash from the boat and sent it flying around Brent's head. Still shielding his eyes and struggling to keep his balance, he hit the alert button. "This is the United States Coast Guard," an amplified voice from the helicopter boomed at him. "You are in a restricted area. Identify yourself." Oh, shit, Brent thought. Anthony, where are you? He went to the front of the boat and got the megaphone Anthony and Jesse had left for him, just in case somebody official came by asking questions. He pointed it up to the light and said, "This is the Houston Police Department. We're searching for survivors. I have divers in the water." With his other hand he reached into his back pocket and took out his badge and held it up toward the helicopter. They wouldn't be able to tell if it was genuine or not, certainly not from way up there, but at least they would be able to see the light reflected off it and have an idea of what he was trying to show them. "Roger that," the amplified voice from the helicopter said. "Do you need assistance? I have rescue divers standing by." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the Wonder Twins emerge from the water, less than 20 feet from the bow of the boat. They were stuffing several large black duffel bags into the back seat of a sunken car. As he watched, Anthony turned to him, a slight smile on his face. He gave Brent a thumbs-up sign, and Brent breathed a sigh of relief. "Hot damn," he thought. "Way to go, Wonder Twins." "Anthony, you guys hurry up," he said. "There are people in the water over here." Anthony's smile slipped away. He said something, but Brent couldn't hear him over the noise of the helicopter. "HPD, I repeat. Do you need assistance?
I have rescue divers standing by."
Fuck, Brent thought. He knew he had to do something, and he had to do it quickly. He glanced around the boat and saw a handheld spotlight. Pointing the megaphone up at the Coast Guard, he said, "I've got survivors in the water." And then he turned on the spotlight and pointed it over the back of the boat. And he froze. There, in the water, less than 20 feet from the boat, were the people he had seen wading toward him. Or rather, they had looked like people then, in the dark and far away, but now that they were close enough for him to make out their faces, Brent saw that they were, in fact, horrors. He looked from one face to the other. Each one had a waxy, yellowish complexion, almost corpse-like. Their mouths were bleeding. Some were badly wounded, almost as though they'd been attacked by dogs or wild hogs, or been thrown face first through plate-glass windows. They had blood and mud in their hair. But it was their eyes that made the goosebumps come up all over Brent's skin. Every single one of those people in the water, regardless of their injuries, stared back at him with white, vacant eyes that didn't blink in the glare of the spotlight. The amplified voice said something, but Brent didn't hear it. All he could do was stare. A man with a nasty-looking gash down the side of his face put his hands up out of the water and reached toward Brent, his fingers opening and closing as though he were begging for absolution. The man started to moan, and from somewhere down in his throat, Brent answered it with a moan of his own. 2 heavy ropes dropped into the water about 15 feet from the back of the boat. Brent heard a loud noise, like someone tearing long strips of paper, and when he looked up, he saw 2 Coast Guard rescue divers rappelling down into the water.
"No!"
he shouted.
"No, don't!"
But they couldn't hear him. They plunged right into the water, one of them swimming toward the closest survivor, the other making broad, sweeping hand gestures to the crew above as they lowered a floating gurney. Brent turned around and ran to the front of the boat. Anthony and Jesse were close now, almost within arm's reach.
"What the fuck's wrong with you?"
Anthony said. "Get in the boat," Brent said. "Right now, both of you, get in the boat." He looked over his shoulder and saw more people in the water, coming from around the far side of the building across the street.
"Hurry, Anthony! Jesus Christ, get in the fucking boat!"
He heard screaming coming from the stern. Looking back that way, he saw one of the Coast Guard rescue divers fighting with a small group of survivors. Brent couldn't look away. The Coast Guard diver was punching at the faces all around him. He was screaming in shocked anger and in pain. They were biting him. They were tearing at his clothes and at his face, raking his dive mask with their fingernails. And as Brent watched, the water around the man turned a murky green. They had got to the other diver as well. He was waving furiously at the helicopter to raise him up, and at the same time trying to fight off a narrowing ring of attackers. Brent could hear the man screaming for help. In the flickering light from the helicopter's strobes, he could see the man's face was twisted by panic and pain. And then, as the rope that led up to the helicopter went taut and an invisible pulley began to turn, Brent saw something that he couldn't believe. 2 of the crazed survivors were clinging to the rope. One had his arms wrapped tightly around the rescue diver's shoulders, and he appeared to be tearing the man's ear off with his teeth. The other survivor was several feet above the rescue diver, entangled in the rope, flailing madly for the diver just out of reach below him. Brent watched the 3 of them rise up to the helicopter. He saw frantic movement to the Jayhawk's open cabin door, and then the survivor who had been entangled by the rope pulled himself up and over the threshold and crawled inside. "Oh, my God," Brent said. The helicopter held its position for just a moment. Brent thought he heard yelling from inside, but wasn't sure if that was real or just his mind filling in for the void the shock had left behind. He would never know the truth, though. For the next instant, the helicopter rolled over onto its side and crashed into the side of a building. Brent gaped at the scene. Somewhere in the back of his mind he thought this should be an explosion, but there wasn't. No gigantic fireball. Instead, the air abruptly filled with bits of brick and powdered mortar and needle-like splinters of wood that whistled past his head and pelted his bare arms like angry hornets. In shock, he watched the crumpled, insect-like wreckage of the helicopter tumble 3 stories down the side of the building and splash into the water. The wreckage was followed a moment later by a billowing gray cloud of dust and aerosolized brick that oozed down the face of the building and spread out in slow motion over the water like a gossamer curtain blown from an open window. Brent was still watching the spreading gray cloud when Anthony grabbed him by the collar and threw him down to the deck. He hit his mouth on something and rolled over. A hand clamped over a bleeding lip to look at Anthony.
"What the hell?"
he started to say, but never finished the sentence. Only a few feet from where Brent had been standing was one of the survivors, who had somehow climbed over the gunwale. He was staggering toward Anthony now, arms outstretched before him, hands clutching at the air, water dripping off his tattered clothes. Anthony had a pistol in his hands, and it was pointed right at the survivor.
"Stop, police officer!"
Anthony yelled.
"Stop, sir!"
The man kept coming. He was moaning now, a horrible, half-drowned sound that seemed to echo from the other survivors still in the water.
"God damn it!"
Anthony said, and fired 2 shots. Brent saw the shots hit the man's center mass, right below the base of the sternum. The man convulsed like he was holding a live wire, but only for a moment. The next instant he was staggering forward again, arms outstretched, the same ululating moan filling up the night.
"What the fuck?"
Anthony said. He raised the pistol and fired a 3rd shot, this one boring a hole right through the bridge of the man's nose and exiting out the backside in a pink spray of shattered bone and brains. The man's body wilted to the floor. Anthony turned to Brett.
"Did you see that? I shot him twice in the chest, and he didn't stop. I did. I shot him. I know I did."
Brent said nothing. He couldn't speak.
"Brent, goddammit!"
Jesse yelled. He grabbed Brent by the arm and threw him into the driver's seat.
"Get us the fuck out of here! They're everywhere!"
Startled, Brent sat there watching Jesse, who had an AR-15 in his hands. They were survivors, their mangled hands clinging to the railing, trying to climb into the boat. Jesse shot 3 of them with a rifle, then turned back to Brent.
"Go, goddammit!"
The night filled with the sounds of rifle fire. Brent hit the ignition, eased the throttle forward, and a moment later they were moving down the flooded street, skirting the wrecked Coast Guard helicopter. And all the while, Jesse kept firing, screaming for him to
"Go, go, go!"
Chapter 7. Once Bobby Hester was gone, they waded through the living room to the back porch, where Eleanor had tied up their canoe. Jim held it steady for her as she climbed in.
"You mind if I ride up front?"
she asked him.
"My shoulder kind of hurts from all that rowing."
"Go ahead."
"You know,"
she said, giving him a flirty little smile,
"later on I think I might need a back rub from the hubby. And maybe a margarita to help me work out the kinks."
Jim didn't return her smile. "Go on," he said, nodding at the front end of the canoe. "I'll paddle." They were both experienced with the canoe, and when he climbed in it wobbled only a little. She felt raindrops on her arms and glanced up at the darkening sky. No doubt about it, they were in for a really bad one. Already the wind had picked up. It rippled the water that covered Ms. Hester's backyard and tossed the smaller trees back and forth. A hummingbird feeder hanging near the back was spinning wildly.
"Yeah," she thought, "this is going to be a crazy one." Seems like I made it back just in time, huh?
He mumbled something she didn't quite catch. Eleanor sensed an unpleasant note in his voice. She turned around and looked at him as he used the paddle to push away from the house. They floated out over the yard. Jim glanced at her, then lowered his gaze to the water and started paddling.
Jim, you okay?
At first, she thought maybe something had happened during his fight with Bobby Hester. Like maybe he got hurt somewhere she couldn't see. But he wasn't acting hurt. He looked mad, pissed off.
Are you mad at me?
She asked. His only answer was a grunt. The first thing she'd noticed when she made it home was how high the water had gotten. Eleanor had been at work for 2 days, and in that time the water from Bay's Bayou had come right up to the edge of their front porch. She could literally dive off her doorstep. That is, if she was willing to brave all the nasty stuff floating around in the water. Their house was on the highest part of the street, and they'd been lucky in that regard. Most everybody else on the block already had 3 or 4 feet of water in their downstairs. So far, their house was still dry, but that was about to change. If the information she'd seen at work was accurate, and she figured it probably was, the storm surge they were about to get would completely swamp them. It would ride in on the standing floodwaters and sop everything in its tracks. By morning, they'd probably be able to go scuba diving through their living room, and that meant they had to hurry to get the last of their valuables upstairs. They went up and down the stairs in a rush, lugging boxes and pictures and the last of the food and fresh water from the pantry. Jim was still acting strangely distant, giving her the silent treatment, but she didn't have time to get into it with him. There was just too much to do and not enough time to do it in. It was the cop in her that allowed her to ignore his moods and push on with the job at hand, even though the woman in her wanted desperately to get him to say something. Anything. She was hauling the last of their family photo albums up the stairs when the shutters started to rattle. Eleanor put the albums down on the table in the upstairs hallway and listened. They were getting the first sustained winds. It wasn't gusting anymore, but coming on in a slow rumble, and she had the strangest feeling, as if she was standing in a passenger jet, struggling to lift off the runway. She went into Madison's room. Ms. Hester had never really managed to shake her fever, so they brought her into Madison's room and let her sleep on the bed in there. She was sleeping fitfully now, Madison sitting on a chair next to her, mopping her face with a wet towel.
"How's she doing?"
Eleanor asked. Madison frowned.
"Not so good, Mom. She's been asleep for the last few hours, but she keeps waking up. And I've heard her mumbling a few times. She says she's cold all the time."
Eleanor saw the battery-operated thermometer on the nightstand next to the bed. "What's her temp?"
101.3 last time I took it. That was about 10 minutes ago.
It's been high for a while.
3 days.
Not good, Eleanor thought.
Okay. Anything else? I've been treating the fever with Motrin and Tylenol, alternating them every 6 hours like you told me to. She won't eat, but I've been able to get her to drink plenty of water, plenty of Gatorade for the electrolytes. Dad went over to her house and got some of the Ensure from her kitchen, and I've been giving her that. But it's not really a substitute for eating, you know.
They hadn't realized it at the time, but when Eleanor pulled her out from beneath her bed, Miss Hester had cut her left arm on the bed frame. The cut was deep, and Eleanor had been forced to use her first aid kit to stitch it up. Madison had been a big help to her then, distracting Miss Hester from the pain while simultaneously handing Eleanor the needed supplies. And together they had done a pretty good job. But the wound hadn't really healed since then. Despite their best efforts, it was almost certainly infected. Eleanor just hoped it wasn't something really bad, like staph.
What about the cut? No change. I've been giving her the antibiotics you got for her, but...
Madison trailed off with a shrug.
Is it still seeping? Eleanor asked. Yeah. It doesn't smell very good either. I've been keeping it clean like you showed me, but it's not healing. I'm kind of worried what'll happen when we run out of bandages. I don't know if I'll be able to keep it clean. We've got a ton of bandages, Eleanor said. Not really, Madison answered. What do you mean? I had a whole case of them in the family disaster kit. Yeah, I know, but she goes through them really fast. She's been sweating so much lately. Every time I check the bandages, they're filthy from all the sweat. Miss Hester groaned, and Madison turned to her. Eleanor watched as her daughter expertly mopped the older woman's forehead. When Madison was done, she got a bottle of water from the nightstand and tilted it to Miss Hester's lips. When Eleanor had left for work 11 days ago, Madison had been a girl with posters of boy bands on her wall and stuffed animals in her bed. But now, here she was, the stuffed animals casually thrown to the floor, caring like a trained nurse for the woman who had been, in many ways, her grandmother. How did such a thing happen? How did it happen so quickly, and without Eleanor seeing any of it? Mom, you okay? Eleanor sniffled and tried to smile. I'm fine. Are you sure? Why are you rubbing your eyes? Are you crying? Miss Hester's going to be okay. We just got to keep her hanging on until after the storm blows over. Eleanor nodded. You're right, sweetie. You stay here with Miss Hester, okay? I'm going to go help Daddy get the last of our things upstairs. Okay. Eleanor turned to go, but Madison stopped her as she reached the door. Mom, are we okay here? Eleanor turned her gaze to the top of the dresser next to the door. There was a little makeup mirror there. In it, she could see her reflection, and the face that looked back at her was dark with exhaustion. It's going to be a bad storm, she said. Maybe the worst one we've seen. But I think we're going to be okay. The house may flood, but we'll be safe up here on the top floor. I know that, Mom. Madison trailed off. What is it, sweetie? The last couple nights, when I've been staying up with Miss Hester, I've been hearing stuff. What kind of stuff? I don't know. Stuff. Outside. People, I guess. I can hear them moaning. Sometimes it's so loud I get scared. It's a horrible sound. I can't really describe it, but it's like they're scared and angry and... I don't know. It doesn't sound natural. Are we okay up here, Mom? Nobody's going to try to... To what? Well, get us, are they? Outside, the rain was starting to come down hard. Eleanor listened to it whipping against the windows before she answered. Nobody's going to get us, sweetie. Your daddy and I, we're going to be right here with you. But there is somebody out there. Bad people. I've heard it on your police radio. They say people are eating each other. Eleanor tried to swallow, but couldn't quite manage it. She was having a nasty case of déjà vu, her mind turning back to the meeting at the EOC and Captain Shaw lying to Joe Schwab about the cannibalistic attacks they'd seen. Christ, what was she supposed to say? How do you answer your daughter's questions about people eating each other? We're going to be okay here, Eleanor said. I believe that. Madison nodded. Eleanor went to the game room. Jim wasn't there, and Eleanor was relieved. Just a few minutes earlier, she'd been looking for a chance to talk to him. But not now. Right now, there was a nuclear bomb of a headache waiting to detonate just behind her eyes, and she needed a moment. Lifting her shirt, she removed her Glock 22 from her waist and put it on the bumper pool table they'd pushed into the corner. It was her weapons table now, stacked with extra magazines for the Glock and for her Colt AR-15A3. There were boxes of ammunition, too.
leaning against the wall next to the table, with the AR-15 and her Mossberg 500 12-gauge. She looked from one to the other, and finally settled on the 12-gauge. Then she took a box of double-aught shot from the table and fed 5 shells into the Mossberg's magazine tube. The shotgun felt heavy, solid, reliable. She muttered a silent prayer that she wouldn't need it. "I heard you in there," Jim said from behind her. Eleanor sighed, then put the Mossberg on the table and turned around.
"Are you talking to me now?"
"I never stopped talking to you." She huffed at him.
"Seriously?"
she thought.
"Seriously?"
She couldn't believe it. This was just like him, so damn passive-aggressive.
"Ever since I got home you've been acting like I've done something wrong. What is it? Why are you mad at me?"
"I'm not mad at you," he said.
"It sure seems like it. Jim, if there's something wrong—"
"I'm mad, okay? Yes. I'm mad. Just not at you. It's not your fault. I'm mad at all this... God damn it, I'm sick of being locked up in this house. I'm going out of my head here. 11 days now. Every couple of hours I go to the door and I look out and all I see is fucking water. It's like I'm trapped on a goddamn island. At least you get to go out and see something besides the inside of our house."
"Jim, that's not fair. I have to work. I don't get—"
"I'm not upset at you, Eleanor. I know you have to work. I know you've been burning yourself up. I know that. Trust me, I get it. This isn't about you, okay? It's me. It's just me being stupid. I hear you talking to Madison about those attacks we've been hearing about on the radio, all those people eating each other. And I feel like I should be doing something, you know? I feel like I'm just wasting away, like I'm worthless."
"I know,"
she said. But even as she spoke, Eleanor sensed that he was dealing with a level of frustration she couldn't really get her mind around. Until recently, she'd enjoyed her canoe trips back and forth from the EOC. There had been a peacefulness that came from gliding through the flooded ruins of the city that had recharged her mental batteries. He hadn't had that opportunity, and it surprised her how willing her heart was to open up for him, after only moments before lashing out at him for being a passive, aggressive bore.
"I'm sorry," she said.
"Jim,
I didn't even think about how isolated you and Madison would be here. Jesus, I should have thought of that. I spent weeks planning what we'd need in the family disaster kit, and it never even occurred to me that the worst part of it would be the isolation. I'm sorry."
He walked over to her and put his arms around her. "We're going to get through this," he said. "We're all right." She pressed her face into his chest and then recoiled. "What?" he said.
"You kind of stink," she said. "You need a bath."
"You and me both," he said, and hugged her tightly once more. Later that night, during the worst part of the storm, Jim knelt on the floor of Madison's room with his wife and daughter. Miss Hester was in the bed next to them, her groaning barely audible over the wind and rain. Outside the house the storm rumbled and howled, flashes of lightning coming through the gaps around the edges of the plywood boards that covered the windows and bathing the room in a purplish-white light. To Jim it felt as if the wind were an avalanche coming down all around them. So constant, so powerful, it seemed to be trying to lift the house into the air. They had decided not to move Miss Hester. Her fever was still dangerously high, and she was weak, and there seemed little point to removing her from Madison's bed when she was already about as comfortable as she was likely to get. Still, he had terrible thoughts about her dying in Madison's bed. He tried to reassure himself that she wasn't going to die, that he was only torturing himself with the usual cruel fates one can't seem to help envisioning for loved ones. But still, there was that voice in his head that just wouldn't leave the thought alone. He kept coming back to it, the way the tongue continually returns to an injured tooth. What would happen if she really did die in here with them? Would Madison ever be able to sleep in here again? Would he expect her to? Something big hit the house. Jim glanced at Eleanor, who was holding Madison's head against her chest. In the guttering candlelight their faces had a yellowish tinge. They sat there for a long moment, stunned and frightened, watching each other and listening as the storm shook and battered their house. The next instant they heard a prolonged ripping sound, like a wall being ripped away.
"Daddy," Madison said, "what was that?"
He shook his head. Whatever it was, a tree limb or something, had almost certainly done some damage to the far side of the house. He could hear the wind pounding unnaturally over there, as though it had succeeded in opening up the house. He glanced at Eleanor once again. She was frightened, he could see that immediately, and a part of himself that he didn't like to own was thrilled by that fear. It gave him the chance to be the protector for once. "I'll go check it out."
"Jim, no!"
"It'll be okay." He stood up and gave her outstretched hand a squeeze. "I'll be right back." He went down the hall and turned into the spare bedroom. And there he froze. The wind was very loud, like standing next to a jet engine. It had ripped a 4-foot-long gash in the wall, and as he stood there in the doorway, he could feel it tugging on him, pulling him inside. There were small tree limbs and leaves all over the floor, and the rain was swirling through the hole. Already it had puddled on the carpet. For years they had been planning on turning this room into a craft room for Eleanor and Madison to share, and here and there soggy, colored pieces of Madison's artwork clung to the walls and swirled in circles on currents of air. A flash of lightning turned the room purplish-white, and in the lingering brightness that followed, he looked through the gash in the wall and could see a long ways down the south side of the block. Many of the houses over there were gone. Nothing left but a wall or a roof tilting down into the floodwaters. As he watched, the Beals house, 2 doors down from Miss Hester's, began to shake. He could see the roof trembling atop the walls like the lid on a kettle of boiling water, and then, with one sudden, ferocious snapping sound he could hear even over the roaring wind, the roof finally came loose and sailed free. It tumbled up into the air and was lost in the darkness and silvery blasts of rain. Jim gasped. "My God," he thought, "we were fools to stay. Our jobs be damned. They're not worth this. They're not worth gambling our lives on this. My God, preserve us, please." The next moment he felt Eleanor at his side. He put an arm around her and felt her shaking. Another blast of lightning lit the night, and in the flash he could see the tears on her cheeks. "It's all gone," she said. "Everything. Gone." He pulled her close, only dimly aware that he was crying too. Later still, Eleanor opened her eyes, a little stunned that she could have fallen asleep while the storm was raging. Even now it echoed in her head. Madison was sleeping in her lap. Her hair was damp with sweat, and it had fallen in front of her face. Eleanor stroked her daughter's bangs back from her eyes, and when Eleanor looked up, Jim was awake and watching her. "You okay?" he whispered. She nodded. From the bed behind her, Eleanor heard Miss Hester calling for water. Eleanor eased Madison's head out of her lap and helped Miss Hester drink from a plastic water bottle. Miss Hester was burning up and barely able to keep her eyes open, and she drifted back to sleep as Eleanor was sticking a baby thermometer into her ear. "How is she?" Jim asked. "Oh, Jesus," Eleanor said. "Jim, she needs a doctor." "What is it?" he asked, nodding toward the thermometer. 105.3. He whistled.
Damn.
Eleanor put the thermometer back on the bedside table, wondering what she was supposed to do, if it was safe to move her. From outside she heard the sound of running water. She went down the hall to the craft room and looked out through the gash in the wall. The sky was a dirty white that made her think of dishwater. Still, the sound of running water went on, even though there was no more rain, no wind. For a moment she wondered if maybe a pipe had burst inside the walls, but she quickly dismissed that. The sound was bigger than a busted pipe, and anyway, the water hadn't worked in 2 weeks. As she stood there in the doorway, her mind went back to a camping trip they had taken 2 years before on the Red River. She had stood on the bank one morning, watching the huge majesty of the moving water, and she realized that was the same sound she was hearing now, the slow, relentless force of a great quantity of moving water. Holding her breath, she advanced to the wall and looked down. She saw a wide expanse of water. It stretched off as far as she could see, only the tops of nearby houses and the canopies of trees visible. The water was flowing around their house, moving to the north. But this was not the dark green, murky water of Bay's Bayou. This water was a greenish-gray, flecked with white foam. Gulf of Mexico water. And it was rising, quickly. Her mind reeled at the implications. There seemed little doubt as to what had happened. The man from the National Hurricane Center had warned them 2 days ago that this might happen. Storm surges from Hector and Kyle had obliterated most of the natural barriers that kept Galveston and South Houston from disappearing under the sea. With those barriers gone, there was nothing to stop Mardel from pulling the ocean along with it. They had talked about the possibility that these storms might permanently change the geography of the Texas coast, and now it looked like that had actually happened. Eleanor was looking at high tide. "Wow," Jim said. She looked back at him and managed to smile.
"Pretty incredible, isn't it?"
He nodded. "There'll be no coming back from this. That's the Gulf of Mexico out there."
"Well, you said you felt like you were stranded on a deserted island."
He smiled and shook his head. Then Eleanor glanced past him. Madison was standing in the hallway, and she looked frightened.
"Mom?" "What is it, Pumpkin?" "It's Miss Hester. She's in a lot of pain." "I know, baby. We need to get her to a doctor. I can't do anything for her with what I've got here." Eleanor walked over to her and brushed the bangs out of her face again. "I'm going to try to raise somebody on my radio. You want to come with me?" Jim and Madison followed Eleanor into the game room. Eleanor got her radio out of her gear bag and keyed it up. "Bravo 8350.
She smiled at Madison.
"It'll be okay, Pumpkin."
Eleanor checked the radio. It was nearly fully charged. She keyed the radio again.
"Bravo 8350 to EOC."
All she got was dead air. "Why aren't they answering?" Jim asked.
"I don't know."
She switched channels to the SWAT frequency.
"Bravo 8350. Anybody on this side monitoring?"
"Maybe the EOC got knocked out."
"That's possible," Eleanor said. "But that shouldn't do anything to the radios. They're on a multi-trunking system. Even if one tower goes out, another should be able to pick up the slack."
Out of habit, she checked the display on the front of the radio. She was on the right channel, and she had plenty of battery life. She was starting to get worried. "So what does that mean?" Jim asked.
"It means I'm sending signals," Eleanor thought. "There's just nobody on the other end to answer."
Her gaze shifted from Jim to Madison.
"It'll be okay,"
Eleanor said to her.
"I'll keep trying."
From somewhere downstairs, Eleanor heard the sound of splashing water. She looked up at Jim, and could tell by his expression he'd heard it too. The sound continued, and Eleanor had a chilling thought.
"Someone's in the house."
She picked up the Mossberg and racked a shell into the chamber.
"You two stay here,"
she said, and went to the head of the stairs. There was a man standing down there, his features lost in the shadows, water dripping from his tattered clothes. She thought, "Not right. He is all wrong." Then the figure stepped forward, and she saw it was Bobby Hester. He looked like a drowned man. His shirt was nothing but a rag matted to his bone-skinny meth-addict's body. His long hair was plastered to his face. There was an open wound on the right side of his chest that made him look as if somebody had tried to carve him open with a spoon. Her first instinct was that he was dead. Eleanor had seen many corpses during her time as a cop, and Bobby Hester, impossibly, looked exactly like a corpse. It was his eyes more than anything else that froze her there, unable to raise the shotgun. There was a dead vacancy in his eyes, the same vacancy she had seen looking up at her from traffic fatalities and murder victims. Bobby raised his left hand, and it thumped into the wall. He seemed unable to raise his right arm above his waist. A sickening moan welled up from within him, and he started up the stairs toward her. She thought, "This is not real, not happening." And then, in the same mental breath, "But it is. It is. You need to leave, Bobby," she said. But Bobby didn't stop. He walked onward, his steps awkward, clumsy. He tripped and pitched forward, landing on his chin, then slowly pushed himself up and back onto his feet with his one good arm. Bobby was halfway up to her now. "Bobby, I'm going to shoot you! Turn around and walk away!" He reached for her, and his fingertips were white as a fish's belly. "God help me," she thought, and fired. He was maybe 8 feet from her. The shotgun blast hit the already shredded flesh of his right shoulder and spun him backwards and around. He hit the wall and slid back down the stairs, smearing a long, clotted trail of blood behind him. She lowered the shotgun and put a hand over her mouth. Jesus, what had she done? "Mommy!" Madison's scream jolted her back to the moment. She ran back to the game room. Jim was holding Madison in his arms, but he let her go when Eleanor appeared in the doorway. "Mommy!" Madison grabbed her around the waist, and Eleanor, who was too stunned to respond, let the shotgun's muzzle dip to the floor. "Eleanor?" Jim asked. "Are you okay? What happened?" "Bobby Hester," she said. She glanced back toward the stairs. "I shot him." "What?" He ran forward, took the shotgun from her, and guided her to a chair. She dropped down into it. "Jesus, Eleanor, are you okay? Did he hurt you?" All she could do was shake her head no. "He didn't look right." "Did you kill him?" She raised her gaze up to meet his, and she thought, "No,